$65 billion. That is the number the federal government printed on the indictment of one man. A man who had served as chairman of the NASDAQ stock exchange, who dined with regulators, who was celebrated on the charity circuit from Manhattan to Palm Beach. For nearly 2 decades, Bernard Lawrence Madoff ran the largest Ponzi scheme in the history of the modern financial system, not from some offshore shell company or a back alley boiler room, but from the 17th floor of a midtown Manhattan high-rise in a building shaped like a lipstick tube, less than 4 miles from the headquarters of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Hundreds of professionals, auditors, bankers, and federal investigators walked past the evidence for years. None of them stopped it. And the question at the center of this story is not simply how he did it. The question is how an entire system designed to protect American investors became the very architecture that allowed him to steal from them in broad daylight. To understand how that was possible, you have to understand what Wall Street looked like in the 1990s. The Cold War was over. The American economy was surging. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which had hovered around 2,700 points at the start of the decade, would climb past 11,000 by 1999. Mutual funds were no longer a niche product for the wealthy. They were mainstream, woven into the retirement plans of tens of millions of ordinary Americans through 401k accounts that barely existed a generation earlier. Money was flowing into the markets at a pace the country had never seen, and the prevailing mood was not caution. It was confidence. The system, people believed, was working. Regulators were watching, auditors were checking, and the smartest people on Wall Street had it all under control. Bernie Madoff fit that narrative perfectly. He was not some flashy newcomer. He had been in the business since 1960, when he founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities with $5,000 he had saved from working as a lifeguard and installing sprinkler systems. Over the following decades, he built a legitimate market-making firm that became a genuine pioneer in electronic trading. His technology helped shape what would eventually become the NASDAQ exchange itself, and by the early 90s, he was not just a participant in the system, he was part of its infrastructure. He served as chairman of NASDAQ. He advised the Securities and Exchange Commission on market structure. When regulators needed an industry voice they could trust, Madoff was the man they called. His reputation was not built on hype. It was built on 3 decades of visible, verifiable, institutional credibility. And that reputation became the most powerful weapon he ever wielded, because it made the one thing he could never afford to lose, trust, seem like the one thing no reasonable person would ever question. But there was a detail that almost nobody noticed. Inside Madoff's firm, which occupied several floors of 885 3rd Avenue in Manhattan, the legitimate trading operation ran on floors that were open, busy, filled with screens and noise, the kind of environment you would expect at a major Wall Street firm. The investment advisory business, the one managing billions of dollars for thousands of clients, operated on a separate floor, the 17th floor. It was physically isolated. Employees from the trading side were discouraged from visiting. The team was small, insular, and answered only to Madoff himself. 2 different businesses inside one building, separated by an elevator ride and a culture of silence. That separation was not an accident. It was the design. The genius of Madoff's scheme was not its complexity. It was its simplicity disguised as sophistication. Here's how it worked. Madoff did not go out looking for investors the way most fund managers do. Instead, he built a network of intermediaries, so-called feeder funds, firms like Fairfield Greenwich Group, Tremont Capital Management, and the Austrian Banco Medici that gathered money from wealthy individuals, pension funds, hedge funds, and charitable foundations around the world and then quietly funneled it to Madoff's advisory business. These feeder funds charged their own clients handsome management fees, sometimes 2% annually plus performance bonuses, for the privilege of accessing Madoff's returns. They marketed exclusivity. Getting your money managed by Madoff, they suggested, was like getting a reservation at a restaurant that does not take reservations. You had to know someone. You had to be invited. And that manufactured scarcity did exactly what it was designed to do. It made people stop asking questions and start feeling grateful. Once the money arrived, Madoff claimed to use a strategy called split-strike conversion. In simple terms, he told investors he was buying a basket of large-cap stocks, then using options contracts to limit both the upside and the downside, producing steady, reliable returns of around 10 to 12% per year, year after year, regardless of what the broader market was doing. On paper, it sounded plausible, at least to someone who did not look too closely, but in reality, not a single trade was ever executed. The money that came in from new investors was deposited into a single account at J.P. Morgan Chase, account number 1492FN, and that account functioned as the heart of the operation. When an existing client wanted to withdraw funds or received a quarterly statement showing gains, the money came from that same pool. New money in, old money out. That is the fundamental architecture of a Ponzi scheme, and it has a fatal mathematical flaw. It only works as long as more money is coming in than going out. The moment that equation reverses, the entire structure collapses, not gradually, but all at once, like a building with no foundation. Think of it this way. Imagine a bank that never actually lends or invests your deposits. Every time you check your balance online, the number looks right. It even shows interest earned, but behind the screen, there is no portfolio, no bonds, no real estate, nothing. The bank is simply showing you a number generated by a computer, and when you withdraw money, it comes from whatever the next customer deposited that morning. That is exactly what Madoff was running, except the bank had a prestigious Manhattan address, a former NASDAQ chairman at the top, and some of the most sophisticated financial institutions in the world, vouching for its legitimacy. Here is why this matters to you as an American taxpayer and investor. Madoff's client list was not limited to billionaires and European royalty. It included public pension funds that managed retirement savings for teachers, firefighters, and municipal workers. It included universities like Yeshiva University, which lost portions of its endowment. It included charitable foundations like the one run by Nobel Peace Prize laureate Elie Wiesel, which lost nearly all of its assets. When a Ponzi scheme of this size collapses, the damage does not stay inside Wall Street. It radiates outward into communities, into retirement accounts, into the institutions that ordinary Americans depend on, and ultimately, when the government steps in to investigate and clean up the wreckage, the cost lands on the public. By the early 2000s, the scheme was at its peak. Madoff's advisory business claimed to manage assets worth tens of billions of dollars. He owned a penthouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, waterfront property in Montauk, a mansion in Palm Beach, a villa on the French Riviera, and a 55-foot yacht he had named Bull. He sat on the boards of financial industry organizations. He donated generously to hospitals, theaters, and Jewish charitable institutions. He was, by every visible measure, the embodiment of Wall Street success, a man who had earned his place at the very top. But behind that image, the contradictions were already visible to anyone willing to look. Madoff's fund produced positive returns in virtually every market condition, month after month, year after year, with a consistency that no legitimate strategy could realistically achieve. His firm was audited not by one of the Big Four accounting firms, but by a tiny, obscure operation called Freeling and Horowitz, which consisted of one active accountant, one retired accountant, and one secretary working out of a small office in a suburban strip mall. For a firm managing billions, that alone should have been a disqualifying red flag. And the feeder funds that sent him money, firms earning hundreds of millions of dollars in fees, never conducted the kind of independent due diligence that their own fiduciary obligations required. They did not look because looking might have ended the arrangement that was making them rich. And then there was Harry Markopolos. In 1999, a Boston-based financial analyst and certified fraud examiner named Harry Markopolos was asked by his employer to reverse engineer Madoff's returns to figure out the strategy so the firm could replicate it. Markopolos spent about 4 hours with the numbers before reaching a conclusion that would take the federal government another 9 years to act on. The returns were mathematically impossible. They did not correlate with any known market movement. They did not reflect the options strategy Madoff described. They could only be explained by fraud. Starting in 2000, Markopolos began submitting formal complaints to the Securities and Exchange Commission, first to the Boston regional office, then to New York. He submitted detailed mathematical models. He identified specific red flags. He even titled one of his submissions, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." He submitted evidence in 2000, 2001, 2005, and again in 2007. Each time, the SEC took no meaningful action. His warnings were filed, reviewed superficially, and quietly shelved. The agency that was built to protect American investors from exactly this kind of scheme had the evidence in its hands repeatedly, for nearly a decade, and it did nothing. It's September 2008. Lehman Brothers has just collapsed. The American housing market is in free fall. Credit markets around the world are seizing up, and panic is spreading through every corner of the financial system. Investors everywhere are doing the same thing at the same time, pulling their money out, liquidating positions, rushing toward cash. And on the 17th floor of 885 3rd Avenue, Bernie Madoff is watching the only scenario he cannot survive unfold in real time. In the span of just a few weeks, clients submit withdrawal requests totaling roughly $7 billion. The account at J.P. Morgan Chase, the one that held whatever real money remained, does not have it. It cannot have it because the money was never invested. It was never multiplied. It was spent, distributed, or used to pay other clients who withdrew before them. A Ponzi scheme is a machine that runs on one fuel, new money coming in faster than old money going out. And in the fall of 2008, that fuel ran dry. The machine did not slow down. It stopped. On the evening of December the 10th, 2008, Bernie Madoff called his 2 sons, Mark and Andrew, to his apartment in Manhattan. According to federal court filings, he told them that the investment advisory business was finished, that it had been insolvent for years, and that the entire operation was, in his own words, one big lie. He estimated the losses at approximately $50 billion. Mark and Andrew Madoff contacted a lawyer that same night, and the following morning, the lawyer called the Federal Bureau of Investigation. On December the 11th, FBI agents arrived at Madoff's penthouse on East 64th Street. When they asked him if there was an innocent explanation for what his sons had described, Madoff reportedly answered, "There is no innocent explanation." He was arrested that morning, still wearing his bathrobe. The investigation that followed revealed the full scale of the deception. The 17th floor was not a trading operation. It was a fabrication factory. A small team of employees, some of whom would later be convicted as co-conspirators, used proprietary software to generate fake account statements, fake trade confirmations, and fake performance records, all backdated to match real market data, all designed to create the illusion that billions of dollars in trades had been executed when, in fact, none ever were. The Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, the central system through which virtually all legitimate securities transactions in the United States are settled, had no record of Madoff's advisory business ever executing a single trade. Decades of statements, thousands of clients, zero actual transactions. The gap between what Madoff told his investors and what the evidence showed was not a matter of interpretation or accounting disagreement. It was a void. Madoff's legal defense rested on a single striking claim. He insisted that he had acted alone, that his family, his brother Peter, who served as chief compliance officer, his sons who worked in the legitimate trading division, and his wife Ruth, knew nothing about the fraud. Federal prosecutors did not fully accept that narrative. Peter Madoff was eventually sentenced to 10 years in prison for his role. Several employees from the 17th floor were convicted. But Bernie Madoff himself pleaded guilty to 11 federal charges, including securities fraud, investment advisor fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and perjury. He did not cooperate with prosecutors in identifying other accomplices. The SEC, for its part, faced a reckoning of its own. The agency's Inspector General, David Kotz, conducted a comprehensive internal investigation and published a report in 2009 documenting how the commission had received credible, detailed evidence of Madoff's fraud on multiple occasions over a period of at least 16 years, and had failed to act each time. The report did not accuse the SEC of corruption. It accused the agency of something arguably worse, institutional incompetence at a systemic level. The SEC's defense was that its resources were limited, that Madoff's scheme was unusually sophisticated, and that the agency had been stretched thin by other priorities. Harry Markopoulos, when asked about that defense before Congress, offered a different assessment. He said the SEC staff he dealt with simply did not understand the financial products they were supposed to be regulating. On June the 29th, 2009, Judge Denny Chin of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York sentenced Bernard Madoff to 150 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed under the law. It was the largest sentence ever imposed for a financial crime in American history. Madoff was 71 years old. He would die in a federal medical facility in Butner, North Carolina, on April the 14th, 2021, at the age of 82, having served roughly 12 years of that sentence. The work of recovering what remained fell to Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee under the Securities Investor Protection Act. Picard and his legal team spent more than a decade filing over 1,000 lawsuits against banks, feeder funds, and individuals who had profited from the scheme, clawing back money to redistribute to victims. The total amount recovered eventually exceeded $14 billion, an extraordinary figure by any legal standard, but still a fraction of the damage. The distinction that mattered was this: the $65 billion headline figure represented the total value that appeared on client statements, but much of that amount was fictitious profit that never existed. The actual cash that investors deposited into the scheme over the years was closer to $17.5 billion. Of that real money, Picard recovered roughly 80%. But for thousands of victims, the math was irrelevant. They had trusted the system, and the system had failed them completely. The Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity lost $15.2 million. Yeshiva University lost portions of its endowment. Retirees in Palm Beach and Long Island saw their life savings vanish. And in a detail that no screenwriter would dare invent, Mark Madoff, Bernie's older son, took his own life on December the 11th, 2010, exactly 2 years to the day after his father's arrest. Andrew Madoff died of cancer in 2014 at the age of 48. The fraud did not just destroy money, it destroyed families, including Madoff's own. There is something every American investor should take from this, and it is not complicated. If you have money with a financial advisor or a fund manager, check whether they are registered with the SEC or FINRA. You can do this for free in under 2 minutes using FINRA's broker check tool online. Verify that the firm uses an independent custodian, a separate institution that actually holds your assets, rather than allowing the same person who manages your money to also hold it. And if anyone, no matter how credentialed, how well-connected, or how exclusive their fund appears to be, promises you steady, consistent returns that never seem to go down, regardless of market conditions, treat that as the single biggest red flag in finance. Legitimate markets go up and they go down. Anyone who claims otherwise is either lying to you or lying to themselves. The Madoff case exposed a flaw in the American financial system that was not about one criminal. It was about a regulatory architecture that made this kind of crime not just possible, but almost inevitable. The SEC, the agency charged with protecting investors, had received explicit, mathematically grounded evidence of fraud and failed to act on it for over a decade. The agency was understaffed, underfunded, and culturally deferential to the very institutions it was. The feeder funds that funneled billions to Madoff operated in a gray zone where fiduciary responsibility was treated as a suggestion rather than an obligation. And J.P. Morgan Chase, the bank that held Madoff's primary account for more than 2 decades, processed billions of dollars in transactions that, according to later investigations, exhibited patterns consistent with a Ponzi scheme. Yet the bank did not file a suspicious activity report with American authorities until just weeks before Madoff's arrest. The bank eventually paid over $2.5 billion in penalties and forfeiture to settle federal and civil claims. After the scandal, reforms followed. The Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 expanded regulatory oversight. The SEC restructured its enforcement division, increased its examination staff, and created new units specifically focused on asset management fraud. The agency also implemented reforms to improve how it handles tips and complaints from whistleblowers. These were meaningful changes. But the deeper structural problem, the fragmentation of financial regulation across multiple agencies with overlapping jurisdictions and limited resources, remains largely intact. And the cultural dynamic that allowed Madoff to thrive, the tendency to trust credentials over evidence, to confuse reputation with verification, to assume that someone who looks legitimate must be legitimate, that has not changed at all. There is a term for what Madoff exploited, and it is worth knowing. It is called affinity fraud, the practice of targeting victims within a specific community, a religious group, an ethnic network, a professional circle, where trust is assumed rather than earned. Madoff operated primarily within Jewish philanthropic and social circles, communities where personal reputation carried enormous weight, and where questioning a trusted figure felt like questioning the community itself. Affinity fraud remains one of the most common methods used in financial schemes across the United States today, from church-based investment clubs to immigrant community lending circles. The mechanism is always the same. Trust replaces due diligence, and by the time anyone thinks to verify, the money is already gone. So here is the uncomfortable question this story leaves behind. If Harry Markopolos had not come forward, if the 2008 financial crisis had not triggered a wave of redemptions, if the market had simply kept rising, how much longer would this have lasted? Madoff ran his scheme for at least 20 years. The SEC had evidence for at least 16 of those years. No regulator, no bank, and no auditor stopped it. Madoff stopped it himself by confessing to his sons when the money finally ran out. And if that is what it took to uncover the largest fraud in American financial history, a confession forced by a market crash, then the question is not whether this could happen again. The question is whether it is happening right now, somewhere inside a system that still relies on trust more than verification, and whether anyone is paying attention. $65 billion disappeared from inside the most regulated financial market on Earth, not because the regulations did not exist, but because the people responsible for enforcing them chose to believe that a man who looked like he belonged could not possibly be a thief. The 17th floor is empty now. The building still stands on 3rd Avenue, and the system, for all its reforms, still runs on the same fuel it always has: trust.